Chapter 11, Stratification by Gender and Sexuality. This chapter has 3 modules, the social construction of gender, labeling and human sexuality, and women, the oppressed majority. In our look ahead, and how do gender roles differ from one culture to another, we'll address the question, are women in the United States still oppressed because of their gender? And have men's and women's positions in society changed? And if so, how? The social construction of gender is very much like we saw in chapter on race and ethnic inequality, and how race is a social construction. You know, gender is a routine part of our everyday activities. And if we look at the definition, gender roles are those expectations regarding the proper behavior, attitudes, and activities of males and females. And these gender roles are socially constructed so that male-female differences are either created or even exaggerated. Sociologists are very interested in the gender role socialization that leads females and males to behave differently. Gender is such a routine part of our everyday activities that we hardly take notice until someone deviates from the behavior and expectations of a particular gender. Most people, in fact, don't display strictly masculine or feminine qualities all the time. For example, men are expected to be unemotional. Yet it is very acceptable to see men get emotional over sports. In fact, I remember when the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl, and men were very much emotional then. Women, on the other hand, are expected to be emotional. Yet when women are strong and assertive, they're not always so accepted. You know, the overwhelming majority of us begin with a definite sex, male or female, and we continue to be socialized into these roles, masculine or feminine. Now, this construction of gender has very different expectations for males and females. Gender roles are evident in our work, in our behavior, and how we react to each other. And we shall see traditional social norms help reinforce and even legitimize these patterns of male behavior, male dominance in the behavior. Our social behavior, as I mentioned, does not mirror this mutual exclusivity that is suggested by gender roles. Again, as I said earlier, most people don't display strictly masculine or feminine qualities all the time. Yet it's those qualities that are most reinforced in our socialization. Gender roles are not independent. One gender's behavior typically influences the other gender's behavior, how they interact, how they react to one another. Society still focuses, as I said, on the masculine, feminine qualities, and our roles influence how we react to others. Now, boys are expected to be masculine. They must be masculine, and girls must be feminine. Boys are expected to adopt traditional masculine characteristics, and girls are encouraged to adopt traditional feminine characteristics. You know, boys are expected to play with cars and trucks and blocks and toy soldiers. They're expected to be very active and aggressive and curious and tough and, you know, daring, inquisitive, and dominant. Girls, on the other hand, are expected to play with dolls and do household, play with, imitate household chores with items in, the kitchen area. And they're expected to be soft and emotional and very sweet and submissive. So we would expect those differing roles, and we reinforce and socialize into these, distinct masculine, feminine roles in our gender socialization. And an important element as to why these traditional views of proper masculine, feminine behavior are clear has to do with a concept known as homophobia. Now, homophobia is the fear of and prejudice against homosexuality. It contributes significantly to these rigid gender socialization patterns, in that any deviation from the traditional expectations, those gender expectations, leads to this presumption of being gay. And this is especially true of boys, but it happens with girls as well. Adults, older siblings, the mass media, religious institutions, and even educational institutions exert an important influence in guiding children into gender roles that are viewed as appropriate. Parents especially do play a critical role as a primary agent of socialization as well, and in defining what these roles should be for boys and girls. Here are some of the, gender norms when, norm violations on the left-hand side, violations by women, women who send men flowers, or spit in public, and often, maybe use a men's bathroom if there's a long line in the female line. Buying chewing tobacco and talking knowledgeably about cars, opening doors for men. And this was an experiment on, violating those norms, pulling out a chair for a man at the dinner table versus, the other way around. And the norm violations by men, when a man wears fingernail polish, they had men wearing fingernail polish, and doing needlepoint or crochet or knitting in public. Crying in public, and having, pedicures, and applying for babysitting jobs or working at a daycare. So again, we see, we expect these behaviors to be, again, falling into the strictly male or female, masculine, feminine characteristics. And so this experiment was, when we turned the tables on those norms. How did people react? So when it comes to women's gender roles, this is what we're going to talk about a little bit about gender roles in the U.S. Girls typically identify with the females and males in their families, in their neighborhoods and communities, and in the media for the development of a very feminine self-image. Women are often portrayed in television and books as being helpless, passive, incompetent, while males, on the other hand, are portrayed as a variety of characters. Females are typically in the traditional roles, like being a mother, a grandmother. In fact, studies of children's books published in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s and even the 60s found females significantly underrepresented. Now, if you remember in the beginning of the semester, we did our content analysis of preschool children's books. And we had that small selection of the books from the 1940s and 50s, which we compared those more current books. And we did support, our findings did support these results as well. So we found examples of this in those books that we examined. The pervasiveness of these traditional gender roles extends to our education. If we look at Title IX legislation, which was an attempt at gender equality on college campuses, there was an attempt again to eliminate sex-segregated classes. And you'll see, walking in the halls of school when we're back in the college classroom, there are signs of Title IX all over, because schools strictly, kind of follow these Title IX regulations. It prohibits sex discrimination in admissions and financial aid, and it's mandated that girls receive more opportunities to play sports in proportion to their enrollment and interest. So it's a very important legislation, this Title IX. A school or college's federal funding is contingent on three things: The first is that the numbers of male-female athletes be proportionate to the numbers of men and women enrolled at school. The second is that the school must show a history of expanding opportunities for female athletes. And lastly, the level of female participation in sports meets females' level of interest and ability. So if you're interested in a particular sport and it's not offered, they need to have enough interest to provide that sport for young women. So it's a really important legislation in terms of education. Now, in general, women are expected to be, to become mothers. And so, again, education is often geared towards that has in the past in our history. But now, opening up, athletics and other opportunities, STEM opportunities, science, technology, engineering, and math opportunities has become really important for many women in college today. So even success at work. Women have often not been expected to be as important. Their work has not been expected to be as important. So again, strictly following those traditional male-female roles, providing men with more opportunities, where women's identity is not as much associated with those traditional gender roles. When it comes to men's gender roles in the United States, again, socially constructed just like those of women. Family, peers, the media influence his appropriate role in society. So like I said, with young women and women's gender roles and men's gender roles, we look to the people around us, our primary agents of socialization. What are the men doing? Are they going off to work to provide for the family? What are the women doing? Are they staying home and being the caretakers of children and doing the household chores? So we look to the various roles that others do, and we kind of model sometimes those behaviors. Attitudes toward parenting are changing. We've noticed a difference in men's, activities, especially within the family. Men are taking a more active role. Yet studies show little change in that traditional male role. Men must prove their masculinity, and it improves, in work and in sports is where they tend to prove their masculinity the most. The male gender role includes acting in a very self-reliant way, aggressive ways, especially in the initiation of relationships. We see this playing out quite often. The man is still expected to be the one who takes the phone number. They still do that today. I mean, it could be getting someone's Instagram account now. However, dating relationships established today. But in the past, it was taking a person's phone number, arranging the date, courting and courtship, and we'll talk more about that when we get to our chapter on the family. But again, males were expected to be the initiators of that. Now, roles are changing, and many women are taking on that role. Males who do not conform to these socially constructed gender roles are often faced with criticism and humiliation. They might often be teased and called names like, that are, as we saw on that Run Like a Girl campaign. Boys who successfully adapt to these cultural standards of masculinity may grow up to be very inexpressive. Men who cannot share their feelings. We're telling men to kind of, hold into their emotions. And so when they do get older, then, they tend not to be as expressive. Also, men who pursue non-traditional jobs like a male nurse or even a preschool teacher, they encounter negative responses to those types of occupations from others. Now, I'd like to talk about some cross-cultural perspectives on gender. And if we look at anthropologists, they've really documented highly diverse constructions of gender that don't always conform to our ideas of masculinity and femininity. So, for example, Margaret Mead in 1935 points to the importance of cultural conditioning rather than biology in defining the social roles of males. She studied different societies in Samoa and New Guinea and found there to be a social division around different social activities relevant to gender, and emphasized the importance of nurture over nature. Another example is Peggy Reeves Sanday's findings from West Sumatra, and she describes gender roles based on partnership, with women being in control of land through inheritance. So these roles, or these findings, support the influential role of culture and socialization in gender role differences and differentiation, and not the innate biology. So it's not dictated by a person's biology that they take on these roles. It's what culture defines for them. Gender stratifications requires not only the individual socialization into traditional gender roles within the family, but also the promotion and support of those traditional roles by other social institutions, such as our religious institutions and schools that really, again, reinforce what is learned and taught in the family. Even within all of our major institutions, socializing young into these traditional gender roles, every society has women and men who resist and successfully oppose the stereotypes. We have strong women who become leaders or professionals, and who are single mothers, caring for their own families on their own, raising children. We have gentle men who care for children. Many, we're seeing a growth in the number of men who stay at home, and women who go on and become the providers for their families. We also can see the social construction of gender in societies that are engaged in war and social upheaval. So when we have places where, say, for example, U.S. troops in Afghanistan, they were there to tend to ward off terrorists, but they also tended to help improve women's rights in these very patriarchal societies. So wherever they saw violence against women that was seen in public, they tended to step in and sort of help in those situations. Now, the differences between the sexes are not dictated by biology. Also, our cross-cultural studies indicate that societies dominated by men are much more common than those where women are influential. So we're going to take a look at our theoretical perspectives to help us understand these social distinctions. So as I mentioned, societies dominated by men are much more common than those dominated by women, and our sociological approaches will help us focus on culture rather than biology in determining our gender differences. So we're going to explain the stratification by gender. And the first perspective we're going to look at is the functionalist perspective. In this case, gender differentiation contributes to overall social stability, right? Functionalists are about maintaining that social stability, the structure and function of the parts of society. So functionalists believe that families, if we focus in on families, requires these specialized roles. So according to sociologists Talcott Parsons and Robert Bales, these are two sociologists, the traditional gender roles come from the need to establish a division of labor between marriage partners. So women will take on the expressive role, and men take on the instrumental role. So the expressive role is sort of in the emotionally supportive role, and the instrumental role is sort of a practical role. So let's define what these terms mean. So first, expressiveness. Expressiveness refers to the maintenance of harmony and the internal emotion or the emotional affairs of the family. You know, women as wives, mothers, household managers. So they maintain, you know, the stability within the home, the emotional harmony within the home. Women's interest in expressive roles frees up men for the instrumental role. Now, instrumentality refers to this emphasis on tasks, a focus on more distant goals, and a concern for the external relationship between one's family and other social institutions. So men become the workers outside of the home. You know, they handle all the affairs in that, you know, cruel, harsh world that is too dangerous for women to go out there and take care of. So, again, there's a very good explanation in terms of a functionalist to kind of, you know, as women are interested in the more expressive roles and maintain those expressive roles, they free up men for the instrumental roles, and vice versa. So as men take care of the more distant goals and of the family, being the providers, it frees up women to be the household managers. So according to this theory, it sort of makes sense it implies that dividing these tasks between the spouses is very functional for the family. You know, it really makes sense to kind of divide up those tasks and those roles, maintain stability in the family. Individuals who do not fit into these prescribed gender roles could be harmed, and this approach doesn't convincingly explain why men should be assigned to the instrumental role and women to the expressive role, which is where you're getting some of my sarcasm. You know, this is not biologically determined roles, and we saw that in our cultural examples in other societies where these roles might be, you know, reversed, where women are doing the instrumental roles and men are doing the more expressive roles. Next, we have the conflict perspective. And according to conflict theorists, the functionalist approach hides that underlying power relations between men and women. Conflict theorists believe, that the relationship between men and women has traditionally been one of unequal power. Men being in the dominant role over women. And conflict theorists suggest that gender difference reflects the subjugation of one group, women, by another group, men. And subjugation is simply a big word that means to bring under control. So gender difference reflecting, you know, bringing under control of one group, women, by the other group, men. So if we compare this to Marx's theory, compare, you know, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist, and are men. Proletariat, the workers, would be the women, if we align it with Marx's theory. Now, derived from the conflict perspective, we have our feminist perspective. And the origin of the family, private property, and the state, which was material written by Friedrich Engels, and was one of our early sociologists who was really closely associated with Karl Marx. And he argued that this women's subjugation, that bringing under control of women by men, coincided with the rise of private property during the time of industrialization. So this women's subjugation is really part of the overall exploitation and injustice that is inherent in capitalist societies. And this is according to many contemporary theorists. Radical feminists view the oppression of women as inevitable in all male-dominated societies. So women have historically been excluded from academic thought, including sociology. We saw early on in our first chapter how many of our sociological theorists who are women, they didn't have, their works were not as prominent as the works of many of the white male sociologists. Jane Addams, Ida Wells Barnett, to name a few. Contemporary feminists describe a matrix of domination, or this intersectionality. And intersectionality refers to this overlapping and interdependent system of advantage and disadvantage that position people in society. So we have different variables we've talked about, our race, our class, and our gender. So we see these different characteristics that kind of converge. There's social forces that will, when piled on one another, or sort of creating this matrix of domination, position women into either, subordinate, or give them advantage over others, or disadvantage. So contemporary feminists have described this matrix of domination, where several of these social factors, including race, ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, combine with gender to really further disadvantage the low status of women, particularly women of color. So, for example, well-known African-American feminist Patricia Hill Collins coined this term. Feminists have addressed the needs of minority women, yet find that these women are actually oppressed much more by their race and ethnicity than by their gender. So some argue that feminism distracts from the real issue, which is racism. Bell Hooks is another well-known Black feminist who also has discussed this concept. Historically, among Native Americans, gender roles have varied, from tribe to tribe, and many Native American women have resisted these gender stereotypes. Also, Latina women in lower classes are affected by being excluded from two very important social institutions: the family, for one, through male domination within the family, and in religious institutions like the church, by being placed in more supportive roles in the Catholic Church, while men take on the more leadership roles. So again, further disadvantaging women, in addition to the other characteristics, putting them in a particular different social location. And here we see an illustration of this matrix of domination. So it might help you visualize now these different characteristics. And there are some I haven't mentioned, age, a disability, sexual identity, even citizenship status. So having all of these sort of converge, this intersectionality with all these different characteristics, really illustrates how those factors influence our social location. Okay, now the interactionist perspective. And interactionists study gender stratification, again, from the micro level, that everyday, face-to-face, small group interactions of everyday interactions. Whereas the conflict perspective, the functionalist perspective, and feminist perspective are macro levels. So viewing, the larger societal influences on groups. So here we have the micro level of everyday behavior. And according to this approach, gender is socially constructed in our everyday interactions. So I mentioned earlier, doing gender. We do gender by reinforcing traditional masculine, feminine actions or behaviors. And this was an article that was written by West and Zimmerman. Really profound article on doing gender. When a man holds a door or pulls a chair out for a woman, and when the woman accepts that assistance, that would be considered doing gender. So we sort of just engage in these behaviors, sometimes without even thinking about it. Now we can either conform or challenge these gender roles in our day-to-day interactions, denying the acceptance of having a door open for us by a male or having a chair pulled out, or so we can either conform or challenge these roles. Now there has been a continuing investigation of the role of gender in what are considered cross-sex conversations, or we call it crosstalk. This is known, as crosstalk, in the idea that men interrupt, research supporting that men interrupt women more than women interrupt men. And it's not necessarily true because it was studied empirically. So it doesn't support that notion that men interrupt women more than the reverse. It's usually people in a dominant position that are more likely to do the interrupting. And so for many, men are typically in that dominant position. So it would appear then that males are more likely to dominate conversations. But it needs to be empirically studied. We need to do actual research, maybe, again, recording, the number of times, men interrupt versus women interrupt, to really quantify those differences. So here we have a table that sort of summarizes up our sociological perspectives on gender. The functionalist theory sees gender differentiation contributes to social stability. Our conflict theory emphasizes gender inequality being rooted in the female-male power relationship. The feminist theory emphasizes women's subjugation or bringing under control, being integral to society and social structure. And then the interactionist perspective emphasizing those gender distinctions and doing gender being reflected in our everyday behavior, how we, interact with each other either in masculine or feminine ways. In this module, we're going to discuss the relationship between gender roles and our self-identity, which is very complex. Gender roles involve cultural expectations that are learned through our social interactions. Now, human sexuality from a sociological perspective is not limited to physical behavior. So it includes beliefs and values and social norms that altogether sort of govern its expression. It's expressed in all societies, and it differs geographically, historically, so we just take that into consideration. Now, our gender identity refers to how people see themselves as male or female or something else. Most, but not all, develop a gender identity that conforms to biological sex at birth. Now, our sexual identity is the awareness or the self-awareness of being romantically or sexually attracted to a defined group of people. This is also referred to as our sexual orientation. A strong sexual identity may not necessarily emerge until well into our adolescence. And now our sexual attitudes typically and practices will typically change over time, and we see these changes historically. There may be a much more openness in talking about our sexual expression, our identity, and our gender identity. Labeling theorists study how labels are used to sanction certain behaviors, and certain behaviors particularly as being deviant. So the identification of deviant varies significantly over time and in different cultures. We have seen a social stigma associated with homosexuality, and that label still exists. Until 1973, the American Psychiatric Association had listed homosexuality as a condition in the DSM, the Statistical Diagnosis Manual. So 2 years later, it was removed from that text, but that social stigma often still exists. We've seen more positive terms of gay, lesbian being preferred by many. So, again, there's been a movement to kind of support the LGBTQ community. Many people find the categories male and female too restrictive or as inaccurate descriptions of how they identify. And so, many people may see themselves between two of those, those two traditional categories. So we see categories of transgender or also transsexual individuals. Now, transgender is defined as somebody whose current gender identity does not match up to their physical identity at birth, and so they may be referred to as transgender. Transsexuals, on the other hand, take hormones and may actually go surgery to change physically into their chosen identity. It sort of matches up to their what their expectations are and how they feel. So the uses of these terms implies that our human sexuality fits neatly into these mutually exclusive categories, and we see from the examples that they may not necessarily be the case. In this module, we will talk about women, the oppressed majority. Women are, remain visibly underrepresented in the political structure of the United States. Only 6 of the nation's 50 states had a female governor at the start of 2018. By mid-2018, 84 women were members of the House of Representatives and 23 were members of the Senate. 3 women were on the U.S. Supreme Court as of 2018. So one indication that women are a subordinate group is evidenced in this political system. So let's look at sexism and sex discrimination. Sexism is the ideology that one sex is superior to the other. Now, it's generally used to refer to male prejudice and discrimination against women. Institutional discrimination contributes to sexism just like it does racism. So institutional discrimination is the denial of opportunities and equal rights as a result of the normal operations of society. It's not simply that some men are biased against women. It's that all major institutions in our society are controlled by men and are biased in their treatment of women. The government, armed forces, large corporations, the media, universities, the healthcare industry, they're all controlled by men. Now, men also have higher rates of mental illness. Men have a greater likelihood of dying from heart attack and stroke. So the pressure for men to succeed is very intense. With all the power and responsibility comes increased stress, risks of heart attack and mental illness, indicating that consequences come with that power and privilege. Now, as more and more women enter into those high-powered roles and privileged roles, they also are starting to show signs and data as indicating that signs of stress are affecting women as well. The next thing we'll take a look at is the status of women worldwide. What is the status of women globally? We want to think about. In 2001, the United Nations gave an overview of the status of women worldwide and found that women live in a very different world with respect to access to education, job opportunities, health, personal security, and human rights. In many nations, women are denied equal pay, they're sexually harassed at work, or they're dismissed from their job just because of pregnancy. Regardless of culture, women everywhere suffer from a second-class status. Women rarely own land, yet they grow half of the world's food. Women work in jobs with lower pay and lower status than men, yet they make up 1/3 of the world's paid labor force. Female single-parent households are typically found among the poorest segments of the population, and what is referred to as the feminization of poverty has become global. So according to conflict theorists, such as Emanuel Wallerstein, much of the exploited labor in developing nations, especially in the non-industrial sector, is typically performed by women. Despite all of this, women are not responding passively. They are mobilizing both individually and collectively. Now, women's unequal status can be seen in the jobs that they hold, in the pay that they receive, but also in the housework that they do in industrialized countries. So sociologist Jan Paul Heisig found that men do much less housework than women do worldwide. And countries, if we look at and examine different countries and journal entries that have been kept by men and women, how many hours do they spend in various activities? So when we look at the status of women worldwide in industrialized countries, the unequal status can be seen in the division of housework, the jobs that women hold, and the pay that women earn. And here in this graphic, we see gender inequality in housework. And you see the green bar represents men, and the orange bar represents women. And you see that women typically in all of these countries do much more housework than men. And the housework includes things like laundry, grocery shopping, preparing dinners, and caring for small children. You could see where the U.S., in the poorest 10th and then the highest 10th, again, you see, and Chile especially, you see women do a disproportionate amount of the housework. Now, if we look at women in the workforce in the United States, gender bias limits women's opportunities for employment outside of the home and forces them to carry a disproportionate burden inside of the home. Labor force participation has increased steadily throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. And in 2010, for example, almost 60% of adult women in the U.S. worked outside the house as compared to only 41% back in 1970. And this is according to census data. 61% of married mothers with children under the age of 6 were in the labor force. So we've really seen a dramatic increase in the number of mothers that are working outside of the home. So the women in paid labor force increased steadily. The women are underrepresented, though, in men's jobs. These jobs that often carry greater financial rewards and prestige. Women make up only 11% of civil engineers, 36% of computer systems analysts, and 38% of physicians. So opportunities in the job market are very much restricted, resulting in occupational segregation. So women are very much confined into sex-typed women's jobs. Another example, in 2008, 98% of dental hygienists and 84% of librarians were women, overrepresented in the service-oriented type jobs. The glass ceiling, something we referred to or we mentioned in our chapter on race and ethnic inequality. This glass ceiling prevents women from reaching their full potential. It's the invisible barrier that blocks the promotion of a qualified individual in a work environment because of either their gender, their race, or their ethnicity. In 2016, women barely made up 20% of the seats on the boards of directors for the largest Fortune 500 companies. Worldwide, women hold less than 1% of corporate managerial positions. These trends are typical in most industrialized countries. And here we see the illustration of women's labor force participation from 1970 up through 2012. You can see the line of the United States was at 43.3% in 1970, and now it's up to, I'm losing track of the line, there it is, 63.7% in 2012. So a dramatic increase in labor force participation. And here you see the different jobs, women in selected occupations, and the percent. You see very small, on the left side of the table, we see where women are underrepresented, smaller percentages of women that make up these particular occupations. And on the right side, we see where women are overrepresented in jobs like, teachers and librarians and assistants, medical assistants, dental assistants. And they're underrepresented in areas where they would be full-time physicians or dentists, and different occupations like that. And we saw earlier, the table where certain jobs here listed may have higher occupational prestige. And if those jobs, like a physician or a dentist, has a high occupational prestige, but fewer women in the occupation. When men and women hold the same jobs, men usually make more money. So there's a substantial gender gap in median earnings of full-time workers. The gender gap persists even after controlling for age, education, and work experience. There is no convincing evidence that this wage gap is narrowing. Women earn 83 cents for every dollar a man earns. And while women are at a disadvantage in male-dominated occupations, men are at an advantage in female occupations. And we call this the glass escalator, where we see the advantage that men experience in occupations dominated by women. Nursing is the first example that comes to my mind, where there was once, women were predominantly nurses. As more and more men are entering that field, we're seeing the occupational prestige of nursing continuing to rise. And this disparity cannot be explained by women's career choices. Only half of this can be explained by career choice. Now, the social consequences of women's employment. Women face the challenge. They have to juggle work and family. And sociologist Arlie Hochschild describes this double burden of housework and childcare, following work outside the home as the second shift. So she's written this research in this book entitled The Second Shift, Working Families and the Revolution at Home. The 2017 study found that when women are the primary breadwinners, 43% still have that primary responsibility for childcare and housework. So in other words, they're taking on the second shift. They're working all day in their primary occupations and then coming home and doing the household chores and the childcare. So the same study found that when men are the primary breadwinners, only 12% have that responsibility for childcare and housework. Greater amounts of time that women put into caring for children and housework really take a toll on women pursuing careers. Women spend typically 15 fewer hours per week in leisure activities as compared to men. So feminists have really advocated for greater government and corporate support for childcare, family leave policies, and other reforms. Actually even advocating for father, leave for men, paternal leave, in addition to maternal leave. If you look at this illustration, we see why women or men leave work, the social consequences for employment. Women typically leave work for family reasons. That's the highest percent for women. Men do, but at a smaller percentage. Typically, men will leave their occupation for a change in career, but it's usually highest for women to leave as a result of family responsibilities. So we have this emergence of a collective consciousness and this concept of feminism. Feminism is the belief in social, economic, and political equality for women. The movement began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. It was the summer of 1848. And the first wave, we have 3 waves of feminism. The very first wave of feminism worked for voting and other rights for women. So the focus was on suffrage and gaining the vote for women. They won many victories, including the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And this 19th Amendment to the Constitution granted women the right to vote in national elections, and that began in 1920. The second wave of feminism emerged in the 1960s, and this came about with the realization that suffrage had not really led to social or economic equality. And so it came into full force in the 1970s. We saw Betty Friedan's work, The Feminine Mystique, was very, very popular at this time, so a driving force in this movement. Gloria Steinem, again, very active feminist and political activist at this time as well. Alice Paul, again, the original wave of feminism, very well known suffragette. So the influence began to diminish in the 1980s. In 2017, 17% of women and 10% of men consider themselves strong feminists. The term feminism isn't considered, a bad word any longer. It's now considered to be, something that both men and women can attach themselves to and believe that equality for men and women would benefit both men and women and all people in general. So women today do not necessarily call them, they don't call themselves, again, because of the stigma attached to being known as a feminist, but there's really a growing acceptance of women in non-traditional roles. And so, again, everyone's supportive of equality is a very positive motivator. Majority of women say that given a choice, they would prefer working outside of the home, and so rather than staying at home and taking care of children. And so again, having that opportunity, opportunities really mean quite a lot in this movement. Sisterhood, this idea of class consciousness, challenging that male dominance, has been quite a driving force in the feminist movement. During a climate, this is a time of political activism, and particularly at the time of the civil rights movement. Now, this third wave of feminism that's taking place from the 1980s to the present time is really a drive to, again, promote equality, not only here in the United States, but globally.